The 1991 work in Antonito was the continuation of a project begun in 1989. During that work session, Cal Smith's crew, known as F Troop, was busy removing the last three-rail trackage and switch from Alamosa. This was preparation work for a three-rail display in Antonito that would showcase narrow-gauge equipment and two historic wooden standard-gauge boxcars that the Rio Grande still had in Alamosa. The centerpiece of the project would be the Cumbres Toltec standard-gauge idler car. In 1990, F Troop began relaying the three-rail track in Antonito, making the display area ready to hold equipment. In 1991, the standard gauge cars were in place and restoration began. The idler car needed all new decking and the box cars needed to be painted. It's easy to see that neither car had been painted in many years and required quite a bit of paint. Over on the idler car, veteran Rio Grande railroaders Harry Babcock and John Carson did running gear work so that the car could be moved in a train. Here, they demonstrate a simple but effective technique for journal repair.
Piece right here that I'm pointing with this microphone has slipped out of there. Maybe this car had been on the ground, off the rail in other words, and it slipped out. Now what we're going to do is use a very elementary lever we call a dingback, and we'll raise this bottom of this journal box and make it so we can put that wedge, so-called wedge, back in there. There, we're going to put this lever here in place. That's far. Whoop. Now, raise it. Lift it.
That one you might be able to just drive right back in. Right,
just drive it in.
Okay.
Mr. Babcock, you let it down. Just right.
After the running gear work was completed, the idler car was ready for decking and work began. By the end of the work session, quite a bit had been accomplished. The standard gauge boxcars had been completed, and the planking was being finished on the idler car. If you're not quite sure what an idler car is, or why standard gauge equipment is even on the Cumbres and Toltec, we talked to volunteers Mike Schalk and Art Nichols, who explain what this is all about.
This is an idler car, and up to about an hour ago I didn't know what an idler car was as far as where they got the name from. It's a non-revenue producing piece of freight equipment, and it was used between standard gauge cars and narrow gauge cars, or between locomotives in the particular types of cars. This piece of equipment is actually a standard gauge car. Now how this car works as far as the function of it goes is the opposite end has just a standard gauge coupler. This end has a standard gauge coupler right here in the center and a narrow gauge coupler on the side of it, which when not in use can be pushed over and hooked up so it doesn't flop around. There's also two pockets. It's in one pocket on this side, and there's another pocket over here so you can actually switch the couplers around. As you see right now, it could not be used for narrow gauge switching because the coupler is on the wrong side. The car itself is resting on standard gauge track with a narrow gauge third rail in the middle. So obviously that part over there would be used for narrow gauge, the entire piece of track from both edges for standard gauge. I guess the plan is at this point to make up a narrow gauge standard gauge train with this car in between to show people not only how this operation was in effect, but also to show them the difference between the standard gauge and narrow gauge cars, the size difference.
These are two standard gauge boxcars donated by the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. They were built in 1916 and they served as general purpose standard gauge boxcars until 1959 when they were converted to maintenance of way tool cars. And they served in this purpose until 1981 when they were retired because the DNRGW listed them as worn out. They were donated by the DNRGW and The reason they're here is to show the visitors to the railroad and the passengers that standard gauge was a normal part of the Alamosa and Antonito segment of the narrow gauge line before the formation of the Cumbres and Toltec. A train from Alamosa to Antonito could be both standard and narrow gauge cars in the consist operating on the dual gauge track. Of course, west of Antonito it was only narrow gauge, but standard gauge was very much a part of the operation in Antonito, and we want the visitors and the passengers, the railway, to see that this historic display is a recreation of what one of those standard narrow gauge trains would have been in years past.